Okay, so we're recording now. All right. So, let's keep in mind that in order to say, it'd be good for you to max out your chances to get an A on the final exam by just flat out knowing the Bill of Rights. On the final exam, I would be looking to ask you to know the difference between the Fourth and the Fifth Amendment, like that. Tell me, what are the four freedoms in the First Amendment? How does the Ninth Amendment protect rights that are not listed in the Constitution? What does the 10th Amendment have to do with the states? Questions like that, well, you'll see them on the final exam. I'd want you to be able to answer those questions, one, so that you can successfully conclude this class. But then secondly, I'd want you to answer those questions because that's what it takes to be a citizen. Knowledge is implicit in citizenship in the United States. So let's spend our time today together talking about the Bill of Rights. You know, let's use case studies and examples. We'll try to put the Bill of Rights in context. And in order to do that, let's start here with Mark 16, verse 17 and 18. Put your glasses on. And then we'll do a little bit of Luke. Let's see if we can read some Bible today. Mark 16, verse 17 and 18 says, "And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils, they shall speak with new tongues, and they shall take up serpents." Excuse me, class, what shall they take up? They shall take up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. The Bible says the believer should be able to take up serpents, drink any deadly thing, and it shall not hurt them. Let's go to Luke 10, verse 19. "Behold, I give unto you the power to tread on" what? To tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you. Now, who's to say how you should interpret these sections of the Bible? Does the government tell you how to interpret the Bible? What protects you from the government sticking its nose into how you interpret the Bible and telling you, well, these verses say this, they don't say that, right? That's what we mean. Yes, Olson, that's what we mean by the majesty of the First Amendment. In the First Amendment, wait, let's go here. First, let me complete this thought. I am typically moved to talk about snake handling in church because I once saw this video from this church by Pastor Mac Wolf in, I believe it was West Virginia, right? It was a small church, I don't know, not, it's generally small church, but it was lively. Everyone was on their feet. You had a small little band off the side, and they were like, that's how they were doing the church and such. And Pastor Mark Wolford he was exhorting the crowd, what is the size of their faith? Our faith is large. Do you believe? We believe. Do you really believe? We really believe, brother. We really believe. And so he went in the back and pulled out this wicker basket. Do you believe, brother? I believe. Do you really believe? I believe, brother. And then, he threw snakes on the ground in the church. And those folks kept on singing, and they were engaging in their spirit. They were proving their faith, and it was quite the lively activity. Now, who's to say wrong? Does the Constitution protect you from protect you in your right to believe that your faith will protect you from snake venom? Yes, you can believe that. However, what if you are just a visitor in that church and you get bit by a snake or something negative happens? Does the law come in on your side? You say, wait a minute, I was just trying to, visit the church. I didn't know that there were snakes going to be on the floor today, right? So there's a question there about freedom of the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, and Pastor Mark Wolford. Let's go here. Let's turn our attention to the Constitution. Before we talk about it in this form, let's read it. Here's the Bill of Rights. Remember, ratified in 1791. George Washington reached a compromise with the anti-federalists. Remember, and it's James Madison, the father of the Constitution, who gets credit with pulling together the Bill of Rights. All right, in the First Amendment, your Bill of Rights says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. This is what we call the Establishment Clause, where the Establishment Clause says the government will not tell you what religion you have to belong to. And then you see here, the First Amendment continues, no or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We call that the Free Exercise Clause. That is to say that the government will limit itself in telling you how to practice your religion. Not that you can do whatever you want, but the government limits itself, right? Sherbert test limits itself in telling you how to exercise your religion. Now, the free exercise and the Establishment Clause, they combine together to compose your freedom of religion. Now, think about the Lemon versus Kurtzman case and the famous case, Sherbert versus Werner. Here you have the Supreme Court telling the federal government that in order for the federal government to violate your religious rights, the federal government has to prove that it's really necessary to do so. So when we talk about Lemon versus Kurtzman, we refer to it as the Lemon test, or a test that the government has to pass in order to be able to violate your Establishment Clause. In similar form, when we refer to Sherbert versus Werner, we call it the Sherbert test, meaning that if the government can pass this test, then it can enact a policy that limits the free exercise of religion. It depends on what you're into. Some examples here, right? Some folks' religion, Santeria, for example, sometimes engages in animal sacrifice. 1994, always, if we were in class, I'd probably make this a bigger point. But for right now, 1993, 1994, the Supreme Court in the Lukemi Babalu decision says that the First Amendment does protect the ritualistic slaughter of animals, ritualistic slaughter of animals by way of religion. Yes, it does. That's what the Supreme Court says, right? But then on the same hand, you got to be careful, because the Supreme Court also said in the Reynolds case, your religious activity does not protect you from criminal indictment. Olson, it will be cumulative, 100 multiple choice questions. Later on today, I will, like right after class, I will post a study guide for the final. And I haven't even put these slides up. I did, but last class told me not that I have. So I'll do that also. Yes. Now let's pay some attention to not the current crisis that the economy is in. Remember, as of this recording, I think the unemployment numbers are something like 12 and 13 million people filing for unemployment per week, right? What we have here is, you'll remember with me, 2007, 2008, the financial system collapsed. The United States economy is the engine that drives world capitalism. Well, that engine caught a flat tire in 2007, 2008. And you remember that large scale financial houses were having, I'll call them hiccups to their existence. And then some financial houses, Lehman Brothers, wind up collapsing. It was quite a shocking thing. And, these creative financial instruments tied to home mortgages, right? The way that they were bundling these mortgages and then selling them on the market for a commodity for a profit. These things, essentially disrupted the world economy. It made George W. Bush completely unpopular, because his Secretary of Treasury had to go and ask for a bailout for the banking industry. It inspired the Tea Party movement on the right, because certain folks said, it's not the best thing to have happen. We shouldn't be bailing out these large banks with the government dollar, it increases the debt. And conservatives, at least in 2007, 2008, used to be concerned about the nature of the debt. But it made Republicans unpopular on a national level, and Barack Obama sweeps in that context, amongst other things, and he gets elected president. Now, the left, generally upset with the development of global capitalism, said that they wanted the Obama administration to go forward and punish, to adjudicate, to put some of those people on trial, to make sure that they don't ever, this industry, the banking industry, doesn't ever do this to the economy again. However, Obama comes into office and he says, we're going to look forward, not backward. And he prosecutes essentially no one for the financial crimes implicit in that collapse, 2007, 2008. Well, a member of, let's say, people on the left side of American politics decided by September 2011 that they were upset enough about the Obama administration, the way the National Democratic Party had done nothing about the financial collapse. They organized themselves into something called Occupy Wall Street. And they actually occupied a park down there in Wall Street. And this movement spread across the country. Atlanta had its own Occupy activity. You know, they were in all major cities, and even some cities not so major. It was quite the thing. You know, it was quite the thing. They occupied and sat in public parks around the country. And for a time, maybe a couple of weeks, municipalities essentially left them alone. However, municipalities grew tired of the Occupy movement, and they decided, you folks have, just giving you an example, you folks have midnight in order to clear out the park. The Occupy protesters say, you know what, we're not leaving. This is public ground, and we are members of the public. And then across the country, and in particular, these pictures are from New York, the Occupy movement is beat up. They are taken to task. They are dragged around. I want to ask you, what amendment is being ignored when college students on their campus cannot engage in their Occupy movement style protests? What amendment is being ignored, perhaps being violated? What's going on when you have the police department? You're hitting it right, but I'm just going on for emphasis. What's going on when you have the police department? Remember, the goal of the government, rather, that the point of the government exists to control, right? The word government means to control. That young person, put your glasses on, let's see. Yeah, he's fairly young. That young guy holding on to the American flag literally has the jackbooted knee of the police officers pretty much in his neck. This young lady now, okay, this picture and these earlier ones are from the Occupy movement. But this picture here was just so rich, I figure I'd throw it in. This picture here with the young lady coming to the protest seemingly in her pajamas, being faced with, I'm probably not going to say the phrase, right? But that's not a regular shotgun. That's something getting ready to shoot her with a, like a rubber type bullet, like a beanbag type shotgun thing. This is from the Ferguson activity after the police murdered Michael Brown. But still, I think what you see here is police repression. What amendment is being ignored when regular protesters, regularly dressed protesters, are being met by a militarized police force who is even so aggravated that they're aiming their tear gas canisters at the photographer? And then one more picture to press the point. You have citizens protesting police brutality in their t-shirts, and here you have the police showing up with I don't know what you call it specifically, militarized vehicle with a sniper den on the roof, where a militarized police officer. So essentially where we're going here is the First Amendment. Let's go to it. Okay, we earlier just said you find the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment, you find the Free Exercise Clause in the First Amendment. Well, the First Amendment here says Congress shall also not make any law abridging freedom of the speech or freedom of the press. We call this freedom of expression clause. The freedom of expression clause. This specifically means that you have a constitutionally protected right to engage in free political speech. Free political speech. Now, of course, this does not mean that you have the right to say anything, that the press can publish anything, that you can assemble anywhere and petition any way you want. It does not mean that. And of course, there are numerous instances, some more funny than others, but here's one that's perhaps not so funny. But here you have, a white nationalist accusing Donald Trump of inciting him to violence as this white nationalist beat up a protester. And he's essentially saying, hey, I did this because of Trump's language. That's his lawyers saying that, right? And so, I don't know, maybe that's not so much funny, but I think that's really interesting. And so freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression implicit in the right to free political speech and freedom of the press, that then allows us to make a difference, a distinction rather, between different types of speech. So looking at your textbook, there is protected speech, which we call the advocacy of ideas, political expression. And then there is symbolic speech, the famous case, Tinker versus Des Moines. You have a constitutionally protected right to engage in symbolic speech, where symbolic speech is defined as nonverbal but political communication. And then another form of speech is what we'll call unprotected speech, speech that is, look at the bottom of the slide, that constitutes fighting words. Speech that promotes lawless action is called incitement. Speech that represents a clear and present danger to the community. These types of speech, and also some forms of obscenity, these types of speech are not protected by the First Amendment. And then earlier in our discussion on interest groups, you remember that we went through Alexis de Tocqueville's understanding to talk to us about the importance, maybe even the beauty, of the First Amendment protection of your right to peaceably assemble. That's enough for the First Amendment. Let's look at something else. Prepared a few stats for you, and I pulled them directly from this article. Think about this for a second. American civilians, this is relative to 2017, own at least 265 million firearms, but that 265 million firearms, the highest rate of firearm ownership in the world, is in the hands of only 22 to 31% of Americans. And then the majority of these Americans, right? Rather, the majority of these guns are found in the hands of a small group of people. So gun collectors wind up having from 8 to 140 guns in their personal collection. So while there are a lot of guns available in the American market, these guns are in the hands of relatively few people. That might be true. You'll feel free to contrast that, send me an email. If that's the case, then that helps us to explain the amount of gun violence prevalent in American society. You'll look at the Wikipedia page. A mass shooting, I believe, is defined as a shooting where 3 or more people get hit by a bullet in one incident. And you'll find that in the United States, this Wikipedia page that counts it, you got a mass shooting every day of the United States. You got a mass shooting every day in the country, every day. That's right. And we're not talking about, yes, Olson, but, I'm pressing the point here. We're not really just talking about, dots in cities. We're talking about people. This young lady went to Obama's inauguration in 2012, goes back home to her neighborhood. Her and her friends are innocently hanging out in the park, drive-by shooting. She is murdered. This baby sitting in a car with his father, parked. They were minding their business. Stray bullet kills that baby. This individual with the wide open eyes, he decides to go to Sandy Hook Elementary School, and the exact number of faculty and children that were killed escapes me, but It was it was in the dozens, babies. And this individual goes to the premiere of one of the Batman movies a few years ago and decides to shoot up the movie theater. Now, so I'm pressing the point to you. These shootings are horrific. They are killing babies. These shootings are happening. This map represents literally all over the daggone country. And part of that is because there are a lot of firearms. And then another part of that has to do with, just the inadequacies of human nature. Now, let's put that in the context of the Second Amendment. Your Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. For the majority of American history, the question remained constitutionally, what's an arm? Do you have to be in a militia? Who, when it says shall not be infringed, who specifically shall not infringe on this right? Is it the federal government? Is it the state? Well, time proceeds, and by 2008, you have a Supreme Court decision called Heller versus District of Columbia, where the Supreme Court says that the federal government cannot restrict handgun ownership. It defines an arm as a handgun, and it says handgun ownership cannot be restricted by the federal government. Give it a couple of years, and a state case goes through the Supreme Court. And in McDonald versus Chicago, the Supreme Court says that states cannot restrict handgun ownership. So the Supreme Court, ever since 2008, has agreed that the right to own a handgun, at least, supposedly for self-protection in the home, is a fundamental right, deeply rooted not only in the Constitution, but in America's history. Deeply rooted in American history. So then you might be able to go into American history and look at how, yes, I believe that to be the case still, right? Yes, Moya. You can look in American history and talk and wonder how deeply rooted is this? Well, in the writings of James Madison. James Madison says that he put the Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights to assure the Southern states that that the federal government, newly in place, would not undermine the slave system. So James Madison accepted that the inclusion of the Second Amendment in the Constitution was done to have a tool put in the Constitution to institute control over enslaved Africans throughout the South. All right, so here I went through a few things, and I figured I'd show it to you back when, did a little analysis, calling it gun pluralism and questioning where does the money come from to support the National Rifle Association, which as of this recording is in a bit of trouble. And then, looking at the amount of gun businesses that are operating in particular states, and then whether or not those businesses' presence in those states drives that senator to be against what we euphemistically call sensible gun registration. All right. And then to your point there, Olson, you'll see that Georgia law over the past few years has been more open to folks being able to carry their guns. And then we saw a couple of years ago still that then Governor Deal did sign a measure to allow guns on college campuses. Now, please be careful. You have to look at the bylaws. You can't bring your gun into the dorm. You can't bring your gun into a class that has, freshmen in the class, not freshmen, high school students in the class. I don't think it's a good idea to bring your gun onto your college campus, period. But, it depends on how you're living. All right, now let's keep on going. Let's look at the Third Amendment. Let's look at the Third Amendment. The Third Amendment here says, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in a time of war. So this is what we call a prohibition, a protection against quartering of soldiers. You'll remember that in the aftermath, rather the counter reaction to the Boston Tea Party was the blockade of Boston Harbor. And to facilitate that blockade, you had British troops injecting themselves into the homes, in particular of Bostonians. Careful out there, I'm careful. And so what you have here is that the constitutionalists found that this was so distasteful that they figured, you know what, we're going to put this right front and forward in our Bill of Rights. Now, let me move a little bit faster here. I want to keep this recording into one piece. So hopefully it's not too long, but let's look at this. Let's look at this. Did you know that for a number of years, what will happen if I click this? For a number of years, the Chicago police operated a torture warehouse. Wait, let me see if I can open the link for you. Oh, it's doing it by itself. They operated a torture warehouse, right? Where typically it would be the case where if you get someone gets tested, you get taken to the station house. I don't know what happens, fingerprinted, booked into the system, something like that, right? But instead, in this section of Chicago, people were taken to this particular warehouse and, you know, tied to a chair and tortured. How many times did this happen? We're talking 3,500 Americans had this happen to them. And then, of course, because there is a racial history to this country, over the 10 years that this happened, 82% of the people that were tortured in this facility were indeed Black. Does the Constitution say anything about, you know, your government not being able to torture citizens when they get arrested? Think about the Patriot Act. Signed after the September 11th attacks, 2001, the Patriot Act essentially allowed the government to arrest people on suspicion of terrorism and engage in certain, let's say, investigations that would diminish some of your constitutional rights. A couple more examples. You also have here, wait a minute. Yeah. You also have here, based on the revelations from folks like Edward Snowden and Chelsea, formerly known as Bradley Manning, you have it proven to the American people that the National Security Agency is engaged bulk monitoring of all electronic communication. What amendment are we talking about here? And then let me bring up to you the murder of Katherine Johnston, which occurred in 2006. The police officers essentially kicked in her door, coming in the front and the back of the house. Katherine Johnston is upwards of 92 years old. They did this police raid in the wee hours of the morning, 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. And in the process of this raid, they wound up shooting the 90-something-year-old Katherine Johnston to death. The question is asked, why were you in this house? And so the police said, we have it on good knowledge that Katherine Johnston is selling marijuana in this house. Okay, well, police officers prove it. And then, you know, they said, yes, here is the confidential confidential informant, or the snitch that tells us that Katherine Johnston is selling marijuana. Then here is the bag of marijuana. Right? Yes, Olson, they had what's called a no-knock warrant, which allows the police to literally just kick in the door. Were they in danger? Okay. And so the question then becomes, why was it necessary to shoot her? What was happening there? The Atlanta police then said that she was shooting at them, thereby necessitating the 92-year-old Katherine Johnston to, for them to shoot her. And then they said, here is the gun that she was using. They didn't pull out an AK-47. They didn't pull out some kind of automatic 9mm. They pulled out what looked to me like a 22, like a Saturday night special, a gun that you had to pull back the hammer in order to pull the trigger, right? Not automatic, but whatever you call this action here, right? And so they would have us believe that at 90-something years old, at 3 o'clock in the morning, Katherine Johnston, sleeps with this gun underneath her pillow. So then when the police kick in the door, she turns to the front of the house, fires off some shots, turns to the back of the house, fires off some shots, necessitating that the police shoot her. Okay, of course, none of this makes any sense, right? And so there's, of course, an FBI investigation. These police officers are put on trial. Come to find out that the no-knock warrant that they had was for a different house. They were at the wrong address. That they produced a confidential informant after the fact, that guy didn't tell them anything. They put pressure on that guy to make them, say that they were there. The bag of marijuana, the police brought that with them. The gun that she supposedly used, the police brought that gun with them. And you know how they do the ballistics and show you the wires moving through the house. The ballistic test done by the FBI proved that the police officers came in the front and the back of the door and were shooting at each other, and in the process turned their guns on Katherine Johnston in her bed. The house was really small. And so police officers kicking in the door and murdering your fellow citizens, what does all of this have to do with, right? And so here's your Fourth Amendment to you. Let's read the language of the Fourth Amendment. Amendment 4 here says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable search and seizure shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause. I would have you keep in mind for the final exam that the Fourth Amendment protects us against unreasonable search and seizure and says that police officers must have a warrant, however, protects based on rather probable cause. Probable cause. Something is ringing on my computer, and I don't really know what that is. All right, let's keep on going. I'm a little bit after the half-hour mark. Let me do a couple of more amendments before I stop talking. Hang with me if you can. Look at this line here, right? So you'll click into these news articles when you have a second. But in 2017, we were able to find in multiple examples, this is not 3 articles on the same thing. We're talking about multiple examples of Baltimore police officers arresting people, turning their own cameras on, and then filming themselves planting drugs on the person that they were arrested. And there's another article in here about this happening in California. You have the police officer filming himself dropping a bag of, I don't know, a little package of drugs on the floor and says, oh, this came out of your wallet, right? And so what does the Constitution have to say about this type of activity? Let's turn our attention to the Fifth Amendment. I would have you keep in mind 3 things that are found in the Fifth Amendment. Number one. All right, the first thing I want you to keep in mind for the Fifth Amendment is where it says no person shall, nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. We call that double jeopardy, right? That you can't be tried twice for the same thing. Here, the Fifth Amendment says that you can't be compelled to be a witness against yourself. We call that the right to remain silent, or we'll call that a protection against self-incrimination. When they say, I plead the Fifth, they're talking about the Fifth Amendment. And then we'll also find here in the Fifth Amendment a protection for due process. You remember, if it wasn't this past conversation, then in an earlier conversation, the Fifth Amendment, the protection of due process is found in the 14th Amendment, right? And so we see it here in the Fifth Amendment saying specifically that the federal government has a responsibility to protect citizens' rights. Due process means that means that the people who are in charge of implementing the law must themselves follow the law. So as we do the slides, I've got a few definitions there for you, and then we've got some other stuff. You got me up. I do not know anything about that Fifth Amendment skit, but that sounds like something I should look up on YouTube. All right, so I guess I should stop talking now. Please be sure to track the rest of this argument that I'm making for you. My goal is for you to really get to know your Bill of Rights. Take a minute and I'm offering these examples for you because the Bill of Rights is nothing if it doesn't, play itself out in the real world. Oh, many thanks, Olson, many thanks. And so pay attention to some of this stuff. Wait. Before you go, wait, let me take this last part off the recording. So thank you for listening. Let me stop.